It's hard to imagine how a town could sprout from such an unforgiving landscape.
You come to America to look for a better life. They brought with them that hard work ethic.
Hewn out of a mountain and propped up over the water on stilts.
Men who come to Alaska are sometimes renegades, looking for a better life or running away from something.
Built by miscreants and missionaries, merchants and mountain men, women of valor, and ladies of negotiable affection.
They're strong, they're motivated because of hardship.
A kaleidoscope of characters forged a frontier and built a community like no other in America. But before Ketchikan was even a twinkle in God's eye, there were salmon. Who knows when the first salmon spawned along the banks of Ketchikan Creek? According to native lore, the Tlingit people had been setting up seasonal fish camps along the creek since the beginning of time.
Ketchikan Creek is not just any old creek. It's the why that my ancestry came here to this location for thousands of years. Usually arrive by mid-June, remain here through the end of September, processing salmon by smoking or sun-drying.
There are probably as many different versions of how Ketchikan got its name as there are people in Ketchikan. There are a variety of variations on it based on a Tlingit word, kan.
When you hear the whooshing sound of the eagle's wings flying by you, in our Tlingit language we'd say Ketchikan. Ketchikan means the thundering wings of an eagle.
There is no one answer that everyone agrees to. The word kan means home or house or even area belonging to someone, and everyone would say, well, Ketchikan means that it was Kitch's area. Of course, that begs the question, who was Kitch? As far as we know, there was no Kitch.
I asked Forrest Dewitt Sr., I said, how did Ketchikan get its name? He said, well, I think it's Ketchikan Han. Han is crick, and Ketchikan means white spot on a fish. And a white spot on a fish is a spawned out salmon. Ketchikan Han, it means the cycle of life and the continuing cycle of life for many, many generations. And that's a pretty nice name.
Like any valuable treasure, Ketchikan Creek salmon have been a source of contention since the town began. Legend has it that Ketchikan actually started over a fish fight.
Ketchikan in the 1890s was primarily a collection of shacks and a couple of businesses huddled around the mouth of Ketchikan Creek. Loring was a real town, Ketchikan was not. And those two communities ended up going into a battle to the death, so to speak. The folks up in Loring felt that they owned that creek. And they came down here and tried to basically set up nets at the front of the creek and take all the salmon before they could get up the creek. What you ended up with having was a salmon war, where you actually had fist fights and people fighting in boats and stuff at the mouth of the creek. Ketchikan won. Loring still exists. It's a small little village, but Ketchikan is now a real community.
The Lord's Army began arriving in Ketchikan in the late 1800s. There to save and to serve, missionaries promised to build schools and churches for the native people if they moved in from their remote villages.
When the missionaries came into this area, we were seeing the need for education, and some of the leaders, the native leaders at that time, they probably agreed with the changing of times that they would see that their children and generations that come would have to have education.
The Episcopalian here in Ketchikan was more domineering, as I understand it. You're going to be an Episcopalian whether you like it or not. You're going to our church and you're going to go to our school. That was the beginning of assimilation from the Tlingit culture into the Western world.
With native groups no longer scattered throughout coastal southeast, and miners, loggers, and other transient workers constantly coming and going, there was a convergence of people from two very different worlds. Missionaries were integral to helping Alaska Natives find some peace amidst a difficult time of forced assimilation into Western culture. While the new state began to pick up the pieces of its commercial fishery, another industry began to boom.
There were a lot of events that happened then. The pulp mill was being built, the tunnel was being punched through. Lots and lots of men came here, single men. There were men everywhere, and they were wild and woolly guys. You wouldn't take most of them home to meet your mother. Yeah, there's a lot of men in Alaska. The odds are really good, but boy, the goods are odd. In Ketchikan, we had a logging community that would fly into town, spend their money boisterously, and it was wild.
In the logging days, it wasn't unusual to see a guy sitting in a bar and blow, $1,500, $2,000 on the weekend just buying rounds for the house. And you had some of the most interesting collections of personalities and characters you ever cared to see.
So we saw like a boom in the 50s and 60s. The economy was always on the upward swing, and doing business here was just like being in a boom town.
For over 40 years, logging and related industries employed nearly 30% of the people in Ketchikan. The whole town benefited from those big boom years, which meant that the whole town was affected when the boom went bust.
Certainly all the industries in this area are cyclical. But the interesting thing is, in most communities, when an industry goes under, the town goes under. Here, the town has just kept going and sort of reinvented itself.
Ketchikan has never stayed the same ever. You might as well just think of it as change.
Ketchikan community has done a good job of preserving its history and heritage sites. One of the first restoration projects was tied to the Civilian Conservation Corps, established by President Roosevelt in the 1930s. In southeast Alaska, this meant employing carvers to recreate totem poles that had been left behind when the native people moved from their coastal villages.
Well, my grandfather was a well-known carver in his days, and he assisted on the CCC project. During the CCCs throughout America, they played a good part in as far as bringing back totem poles in the new founded villages. They're examples for today's younger generations. If it wasn't done, all these poles that we had would probably have disintegrated and degraded into nothing, and we wouldn't have them today. I'm able to look at works of my great-grandfather also and my grandfather. So these parks are pretty vital to us.
The project was a great success, and as a result, Ketchikan is home to the largest collection of standing totem poles in the world.
Ketchikan has more historic properties than any other city of Alaska. We built a lot of buildings in the early 1900s, and they remain today.
Well, I guess all these buildings around here are younger than I am.
We have a very committed group of people who want to do everything they can to tell the story of Ketchikan, to protect what we have. Buildings and neighborhoods that are deteriorated, and via historic preservation bring those buildings and neighborhoods to life. Creek Street was a good example. It was all a rundown neighborhood, buildings falling into the creek, only a few left. It had played such a role in our history. So many of these other buildings have played significant roles too. You want to be able to document that, remind people of the history of their community. You want to preserve that character in the community.
People haven't paid close attention to their own backyards at their own places. And somehow we did here. So when it was ready to bloom, it did. It bloomed beautifully.
They say history repeats itself, and sometimes I really hope that that is true, because we've got some great history here that's definitely worth repeating.
There's a lot of hard-headed stubbornness here, and that's why we're still here 100 years later.
Preserving our history, and more importantly, sharing it with people. History doesn't have to be dry, historic colors don't have to be boring. History can really be just the glorious window to your past and understand how this town evolved and why.
The future is pretty solid. We've weathered some pretty tough storms already.
This is a town without pretense. It just gets down, it's bar fight nasty sometimes, you know, but it's also just rich and alive and rough and tumble, and it's fun to be around.